On a week where the weather looked good and no work in the diary, I spontaneously decided to pack my panniers and head off on a cycling trip to Mont Saint-Michel in the French region of Normandy. So I left my home in Brighton, cycled along the Undercliff path and onto the ferry port in Newhaven. I boarded the ferry with a couple of other cyclists, said goodbye to the UK and its famous white cliffs. I tried to spot whales and dolphins from the boat, and to my astonishment I saw none. Did see a seagull though. And 4 hours later I had arrived at the site of more white cliffs and was saying hello to France, the town of Dieppe to be precise. At first glance it looked a bit like Brighton, except people didn't have a clue what I was saying and I didn't understand them either. A quick look around the centre and then I was off and found myself in the French countryside surrounded by some of my biggest fans. Soon realised that taking a photo of myself and my bike isn't the easiest thing to do, so I settled for this selfie and carried on. I stumbled upon this nice church, which also had this random treehouse church. It's got to be the most unique and smallest church I'd ever been in. I met another cyclist, but he didn't say much. Bit of a pothead, I think. Then after a day of cycling 60 miles, I had somehow made it to San Francisco. Actually, I was still in France, but this sure did look like the Golden Gate Bridge.
Bonsoir, this is my home for tonight. It's been a really great day today. Cycled about 60 miles, beautiful countryside, hardly any traffic, wicked.
The view over the River Seine was great, apart from the loud container ships that passed throughout the night. I woke up to a glorious day, left my camp spot, and I soon found myself riding on a challenging and questionable path through a nature reserve. It did have some nice wildlife and scenery though. Amazed not to have a puncture, I crossed this huge bridge near the port of Honfleur until I reached the seaside resort of Cabourg, in which I had my first well-needed shower. This town has a large sandy beach and some bustling streets full of shops and places to eat. After I'd refuelled with this tasty quiche and some spoonfuls of chocolate spread, I was back on the road with a knee that was starting to give me some serious aggro. You wouldn't know it from this photo, but I was in some serious pain here. I pushed on to my second camp spot. Luckily a farmer saw me and assumed I was looking for somewhere to pitch up. He said I could camp in his field, which was a huge bonus. I could relax knowing that I wouldn't get bothered. After a peaceful night's sleep and a top up of water from a hose in the field, I carried on through some quintessential French countryside and followed this old railway line path towards my destination. About 200 miles from leaving Brighton, I got my first glimpse of Mont Saint-Michel. It was an incredible sight to see. A huge island of medieval buildings and spires appeared from nowhere in what was an otherwise flat area. The closer I got, the more magnificent it looked. You'd be forgiven to think it was in fact the Disney castle.
Not a bad spot for dinner. Yeah.
I celebrated my destination with a few victory photos and then cycled the final mile or so to the tourist area close to the island. It was full of big hotels and tour buses, and randomly, Spider Cow. Thankfully they also had a campsite in the tourist area, so I pitched my tent and then went to inspect what happens if you miss a spot with sun lotion. A silly, painful vest-shaped burn mark is what happens. There's a bus that leads the tourist resort to the island, but I chose to cycle. At first it looked like I'd arrived in Japan, then a set from Harry Potter. It was very touristy, but understandably because it was pretty spectacular. There were overpriced gift shops, overpriced restaurants, and overpriced places to buy refreshments. After I blew my whole budget on a chocolate ice cream, I began the climb to the top to see the church and its impressive view. It was painful with my sore knee, but I'm glad I did it, as you could see for miles and watch the tide come in and surround the island. The next day or two I spent taking countless photos from various angles. I was very lucky to be there during some incredible sunsets. Here's a few I took, including some that I captured with my drone. Once I'd covered every conceivable angle, it was time to head home. I knew it was a long way, so I was pretty apprehensive due to my painful knee and my sore bum from the saddle, but I made this extremely high-tech cushion solution. It was a total result on all bases. Much comfier, and the extra height sorted out my sore cyclist's knee. I passed coastal towns where I think Edward Scissorhands had also been, saw impressive churches, but I couldn't tell you what the city was called. I wild camped next to a swamp. I even saw a beaver, I think. Well, it sure did look like one anyway. The following day was a hot one, and I spent a few hours exploring the picturesque port town of Honfleur. It's a pretty oldie-worldy place with tall buildings lined with shops, bars and restaurants, where you can sit and watch the boats come into dock. Later on that evening I found my final camp spot, a much nicer swamp minus a beaver, but it did have an extremely loud deer that scared the out of me in the middle of the night. My final day saw me cycling through some very pretty French countryside with some pretty wind turbines, pretty cows, pretty chateaux and even some pretty dogs. Some might even say sexy. I finally made it back to Dieppe and had some time to kill before my ferry set off, so I celebrated with an almond croissant and had a walk on the pier before I boarded the ferry and sailed back to New Haven. I arrived to another beautiful sunset, cycled the final section back along the Undercliff path, and about 500 miles later I was back at home and in my flat in Brighton.